Morning. At the outset, I want to apologize for being a few minutes late. Florida, my home state, is facing a catastrophic hurricane that's headed towards the Florida Panhandle and the Big Bend. Category 4, 145, 155 mile an hour winds, and so I was delayed speaking to the White House about it. And just at the outset, I want to say, of course, my prayers are with the people of our home state, and we're going to keep a close eye on it. But that's why I was late, and I apologize. But I thank you for being here today at the release of our 2018 annual report of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. And I want to begin by thanking the expert staff of the Commission for the hard work over the last several months on this report. And I want to thank the co-chairman, Congressman Smith, whose partnership on the Commission I greatly value, in addition to our other House and Senate commissioners who also put in a lot of time and input in the product that you're going to read about and hear about today. Let me begin a little bit by describing the Commission, its mandate. When it was established through the U.S.-China Relations Act, which also, by the way, extended permanent normal trade relations to China, it was to monitor human rights and rule of law developments in China. That mandate remains pressing and urgently necessary, as evidenced by the dire human rights situation inside of China and the continued downward trajectory since Xi Jinping became Communist Party General Secretary in 2012 and then President in 2013. The latter post he is likely to fill beyond the current term of 2023, given constitutional changes that were enacted last year. Now, when the Commission was established, the prevailing wisdom, the widespread conventional wisdom, which remained until very recently, that underpinned the relationship between the United States and China, and that was bipartisan, held by Republicans, Democrats, and every expert in the field, maintained that increased trade and economic relations, as well as diplomacy and robust cultural exchange, would lead to greater openness and political liberalization within China. In the years that have followed, the Chinese economy has grown dramatically, while the Chinese Communist Party has become even more entrenched in the political power structure and committed to preserving its monopoly on power through state-sponsored repression and surveillance, indoctrination, and frankly, brutality. Today, what we see is an ascendant and increasingly aggressive China seeking to not just supplant the United States on the world stage, but reshape global norms on development, trade, the internet, and even human rights. All the while, the fundamental authoritarian character of China's political system under the Communist Party remains unchanged and, in fact, becomes more brutal. Human rights conditions have deteriorated again this year, and that has adversely affected both U.S.-China relations and the people of China's ability to exercise their fundamental human freedoms. Let me just say at the outset, before we get into our major trends and findings, that the criticism here today or at any time is not about the Chinese people, a people whom I greatly, greatly admire, and many of whom we work with in the causes of freedom and liberty. Nor is it a criticism of China or its culture, which has and continues to make extraordinary contributions to the world and mankind. This is aimed at the Chinese Communist Party, and through that, the Chinese government. Now, as the 2018 annual report was compiled, the following general themes and key developments emerged. The first is the unprecedented repression of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which may constitute crimes against humanity. Number two, a dramatic increase in Communist Party control over government, society, and business. And the third is the increasing use of technology as a tool of repression. And many of these themes, in fact, all of them are interconnected. Technology plays a central role in China's gross human rights violations, where a digital surveillance state is working to transform, for example, in Xinjiang, the religious and ethnic identities of local Muslim ethnic minorities. Data-driven surveillance is facilitated by iris and body scanners, voice pattern analyzers, DNA sequencers, some of which are supplied, by the way, by American companies, and facial recognition cameras in neighborhoods, on roads, and in train stations. The striking image behind us here is from one of the so-called political re-education camps. As many as 1 million or more Uyghur and other Muslims are being held in camps just like this. Individuals are arbitrarily detained, and in many cases, detention appears to be indefinite. Local orphanages are reportedly overcrowded with Uyghur children whose parents were taken away to a camp such as this. Also this year, the purview of the Communist Party continued to expand into many sectors of the government and society. The party's Central Committee issued a massive restructuring plan for the party and government agencies to be completed by the end of 2018. The United Front Work Department, which Xi Jinping, like Mao before him, calls the, quote, magic weapon, unquote, of the Communist Party, was further empowered in this reorganization. The UFWD, the United Front Worker Department, works to influence and neutralize possible domestic and international challenges to the party's ideological agenda. It does so both at home in China and abroad, extending even here to the United States. This year, its role in overseeing religious affairs was expanded, underscoring the party's enduring fear that the growth of religious belief is a threat to its grip on power. Also in the reorganization, the party's Central Propaganda Department was given an enhanced managerial role, reflecting the party's efforts to ensure dissemination of a unified message about China within and outside of China. Business is not outside the scope of the party's expanding reach. The newly amended Constitution stipulates that party committees play a leading role in the decision-making of state-owned enterprises. The National Supervisory Commission was also created this year. The investigatory and supervisory functions of the NSC extend Xi Jinping's signature anti-corruption campaign against party officials to a much broader swath of public sector personnel, including state-owned enterprise employees, public hospital staff, and public educators. As it relates to technology, the government continues to find new ways to create a pervasive system of algorithmic surveillance. The government is working with Chinese companies to develop and implement a social credit system. Pilot projects of the nascent social credit system have begun to aggregate vast amounts of data on citizens with a view towards shaping and even engineering citizen behavior. Chinese companies like Alibaba and its affiliate Ant Financial and Tencent, which owns the popular messaging platform WeChat, can be required to hand over data on Chinese citizens. The PRC's cybersecurity law, which took effect in June of 2017, requires companies to store user data inside mainland China, and that, of course, threatens user privacy. American companies are not immune from these pressures. Companies such as Apple transferred operations of its iCloud services for mainland Chinese accounts to a state-owned firm in February. It will likely be compelled to disclose user information to authorities. In addition to the themes I've just outlined, this year's report documents increasing religious freedom abuses, harassment of rights defenders and lawyers, suppression of free speech, large-scale forced evictions, onerous restrictions on civil society, and more. Time constraints today only permit us to scratch the surface of these abuses. The report also includes detailed policy recommendations for the administration and for we in Congress to consider. These recommendations are timely in light of the administration's publicly stated intention to reset the bilateral relationship with China and arrive at a proper balance. I'll highlight just a few. First, embed human rights throughout our bilateral relations. Second, prioritize reciprocity in every area of our bilateral relationship, including diplomacy, trade, investment, media, and cultural and academic exchanges. It's very simple. We should be treating them and their companies, their government, their products, their services the same way they treat us. Third, holding Chinese officials accountable for abuses through sanctions and visa denials and the like. Fourth, promoting internet freedom and counter foreign disinformation here and abroad. And fifth, revamp export controls to ensure that American technology is not being used to commit or facilitate gross rights violations. I believe the Trump administration will be receptive to these recommendations, and I plan to work with Congress, along with Congressman Smith and others, to advance these and related objectives legislatively where possible. I would now, before turning it over to Congressman Smith, would like to take a moment to briefly acknowledge some honored guests who are with us today. Several of the individuals seated in the front rows have been personally and painfully impacted by the current crackdown in China. Would you please take a moment to stand and be recognized? Thank you so much for being here and for your courage to be here. Because each of you, please sit. Thank you. Each of them has a family member, or in many cases, multiple family members, detained or disappeared in these camps, including Ms. Gulchera Hoja, a Uyghur service journalist with Radio Free Asia, who gave powerful testimony before our commission just a few months ago. I thank you all for the courage in being here today. In connection with the findings and recommendations included in the CECC report, Congressman Smith and I are announcing a number of joint initiatives. We are deeply troubled by what is taking place in Xinjiang and have worked to draw attention to the gross human rights violations being committed. This week, we will be introducing bipartisan, bicameral legislation on this issue, the Xinjiang Uyghur Human Rights Act. We plan to nominate for the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize Uyghur scholar Ilham Tohti, who's currently serving a life sentence on charges of separatism. He's the founder of the website Uyghur Online. This website sought to promote dialogue and peace between Han Chinese and Uyghurs. His life's work stands in sharp contrast to the brutal ethnic and religious policy currently pursued by the Chinese government and Chinese Communist Party. Additionally, we are calling on the director of the FBI to review the unacceptable intimidation, threats, and targeting of Chinese, Uyghur, and Tibetan diaspora communities that are living here within the United States. The Commission often receives accounts from these communities, including Americans and legal permanent residents who are being harassed and threatened here in the United States. This manifestation of China's long arm cannot, must not, and will not go unanswered. And lastly, we will be urging the President of the International Olympic Committee to take steps to review and ultimately reassign the 2022 Winter Olympic Games in Beijing, given the current grotesque human rights violations, beginning with these horrific camps. In closing, let me just say that China's domestic repression is directly related to its international aggression and global political influence operations, and as a result are directly connected to the vital U.S. national interests. Policymakers are now re-examining the flawed assumptions that drove U.S.-China relations for decades. Evidence of this was last week's speech by Vice President Pence. Our commitment to the promotion of universal principles, the rule of law, and human dignity should be a key component of our international relationships and partnerships. We must also remember the brave Chinese citizens who are voicing dissent in the face of expanding domestic oppression. Consider, for example, the recent escalation of the Chinese government and Communist Party's war on religious freedom. In the face of that persecution, many leaders of China's Christian community have responded in truly remarkable fashion. In August of 2018, a group issued a joint declaration for the sake of the Christian faith, and they bravely signed their names to a document stating their willingness to bear all losses, even the loss of our freedom and our lives. Pastors and lay leaders have continued to sign in solidarity. The total number of those who have signed is now over 400. This is a powerful reminder that at the heart of the CECC's 2018 annual report lays this enduring truth. Pressing for China's adherence to universal standards advances not only American national security, economic interests, and moral values, it advances the aspirations of Chinese citizens eager for peace, protection of their most basic rights, and genuine political reform to accompany their economic ascent and progress. I thank you all for being here, and I now turn it over to the co-chair who will speak, and then we will briefly take questions. And I apologize if I leave and come back. The Senate has scheduled a vote, which is set to begin. But I thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it is an honor and a privilege to serve as co-chair of the commission. This is a very important commission, as you all know. It was established. This is the 17th report on human rights conditions and the rule of law in China, and it is getting worse. It is bad, and it is getting worse by the day under Xi Jinping. The Commission's annual report is the gold standard of human rights reporting and ought to be required reading for everyone who is concerned about China, both in the State Department, at the White House, certainly within the media, and all people of goodwill who wish only the best for the men and women and children of China who are suffering under a brutal dictatorship under Xi Jinping. China's government and Communist Party have become more repressive in domestic politics, more mercantilist in trade and economic policy, increasingly dismissive of international norms and more assertive in spreading their model of authoritarian governance globally. You know, we've had hearings in my subcommittee. I chair the Human Rights Subcommittee, as well as on the China Commission, on this effort of what they call soft power, the Confucius Institutes, to spread lies and deception all over the world, not only in the United States, where many of our universities and colleges have bought into allowing them to inculcate a false narrative about China, but it's happening all over Europe. It's happening all over Africa. I chair the Africa Committee as well, and we've had hearings on what they're trying to do to change perceptions of this dictatorship. As the report shows, it's been another disastrous year for Chinese human rights defenders, for democracy activists, for religious leaders, and labor activists. What has already been the illegality of independent trade unions has now gotten even worse, as men and women who want to form trade unions are being hunted down and put into prison. They've been there before, but it has gotten far worse. They have a state-run labor organization, which is an absolute farce. The crackdown on religious groups, and as Senator Rubio said a moment ago, the Uyghurs, the human rights lawyers, as I said before, has not been this severe since the Cultural Revolution. I want to reiterate as strongly as possible, as the chairman said a moment ago, that we care about the Chinese people, the men, the women, and the children who are suffering under this iron grip by this fist that is being forced upon them. They deserve better. They deserve freedom and democracy and internationally recognized human rights. They're not getting it from Xi Jinping. The senator and I first publicly raised the issue of arbitrary detentions of Uyghurs in January of 2018. We were among the first public officials to raise the alarm. The work of the CECC brought global attention to the Orwellian detentions of over a million Uyghurs and other Muslims. As the senator said, you look at that picture, these are detention camps, these are re-education camps where people are killed, where they are tortured, and they are brutalized in so many, many ways. You know, we have with us Rubio Kadir. Rubio Kadir is a tremendous human rights activist, a leader for many, many years. She has now 37 members of her family and extended family who have been arrested and disappeared as part of this crackdown. As the chairman said a moment ago, Gulchera Hoja, who's a Radio Free Asia correspondent, one of 6 who does the Uyghur reporting, her family has been, an extended family, have been rounded up to the tune of 23 members. I would ask the members of the press, you need to raise this as a journalism issue. Here's a woman who has raised issues regarding human rights and the rule of law with regards to the Uyghurs. And what do? They go after her family and incarcerate them. Every single journalist needs to raise this broadly on all the human rights issues, but journalists are being so picked out, and these are American journalists who are reporting the truth about what's going on there. Over the past year, as the chairman said a moment ago, the Chinese government has intensified its most severe crackdown on all religious faiths since the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping has personally launched efforts to what he calls sinicize religion, and the central government has issued commands to each provincial party secretary, making them responsible to bring religion in line with Communist Party ideology. Just a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I chaired yet another hearing. It's my 67th hearing on human rights abuse in China, in my House Subcommittee on Human Rights. And we heard from Christians, and we heard from Tibetans, we heard from others who told, and Uyghurs, we heard the story of how everywhere you look, Falun Gong, they are crushing. If you don't comport with the Communist Party principle and adapt everything you do to the ideology of Xi Jinping, you are going to be arrested, you are going to be tortured, and in many cases, you're going to be killed. When Bibles are burned and Tibetan monks burn themselves in protest, when a simple prayer over a meal in public may be considered illegal religious gathering, when mosques and churches are demolished and Uyghur and Kazakh Muslims are forced to renounce their faith, the China dream is a nightmare for millions upon millions of Chinese citizens. U.S.-China tensions are high at the moment on many fronts, and the Chinese government keeps at least acting like they want to say a rapprochement, a change of relations with the United States. Well, when you so grossly mistreat your own people and your own citizens, We care about them first. Get the human rights part right, and the friendship and the dialogue will accelerate between the United States and, of course, with the Chinese government. Chinese government also continues, as the report points out, to coercively limit the size of Chinese families, violating international obligations. It is a brutal policy of forced abortion that causes unspeakable pain and suffering, especially to the women. And it has also led to an explosion of sex trafficking because of the missing girls and the missing young women in the PRC. This year, Secretary Pompeo and I wrote the law on human trafficking. It's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, singled out China as a Tier 3 country, an egregious violator of human trafficking. And much of that is attributable to the fact of the missing girls, where you're only allowed one and maybe two under the new policy, although that's not working either. You have a situation where there's a gross disparity between male and female, and it's predictable. And now trafficking has exploded, where women are being turned into commodities for sale, and they are being brought in from other countries, including North Korea. Finally, I just want to say, as Marco Rubio said, Senator Rubio said a moment ago, we have an action plan. It's a good one. To think that it's even possible that under Xi Jinping there could be an Olympics Games held is unconscionable. That happened years ago. And what did they do right before the Olympics occurred, the Summer Olympics? They rounded up all the dissidents and the human rights activists and put them into prison. So they couldn't talk to you, the journalists. They'll do the same thing, and they should not be rewarded, not rewarded at all, for this egregious human rights policy that they have embarked upon. We call on the UN, as the chairman said. We call on the administration. We've got the Global Magnitsky Act, where we can single out individuals who have committed heinous crimes and say, no visa for you, you're not coming here, and you can't do business with the United States. It's a tool in the toolbox that needs to be used. I was the author of the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, and I'll conclude on this. And that language, or that bill, gives additional tools in the toolbox on religious freedom. We have a great ambassador at large, Sam Brownback, who has raised the issue of human rights in China and has done so very effectively. Now we need to start, they are a country of particular concern, the actual designation, and what has happened to the Uyghurs is unprecedented. We need to say, now there's time for penalties. There needs to be penalties, and hold them to account. Thank you.
All right, anybody, I'll start with me because I need to skip out. You guys are not in session this week. All right. Any
questions?
Yes, sir?
Voice of America Cantonese Service. My name is Brandon Yap. While you publish this report, there's a situation happening in Hong Kong. The Financial Times Asia editor and also the local FCC vice chairman has been denied for the renewal of the work visa because he was, as a vice chairman, to host the Hong Kong National Party leader Andy Chan for the talk, and so this is kind of the payback for the Chinese government and Hong Kong government. So what exactly the Commission would like to express the position regarding for this issue? And also the second question is regarding for the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act. Do you believe that it might have a chance to suspend for some reason because of similar these scenario happening in Hong Kong?
Well, on the second point about the act, I wouldn't want to speculate. Obviously, that's a broader geopolitical decision that needs to be made. But, and so I wouldn't want to comment on that today without all the information before us about what's being considered through the administration. On the first point, this is nothing new. I mean, we've seen this happen in the past. We've seen bureaus closed in China as an example. So that now that it extends to Hong Kong, where you see increasingly interference on behalf of the mainland government, is not a surprise. I think it's important to understand why they do it, and here's the truth. There are journalists today in the world, including in the United States, who have pulled punches and, I believe, tailored their message in a way so as not to lose access. You make the decision that I'm not going to go too far, or I'm not going to over-report about something. That way I won't be denied access. And that's the goal that they want to portray. That is the goal that they want. The goal that they want is to be able to influence global coverage by denying access to those who go too far or by continuing to grant access to those who constrain themselves. And this is not limited to journalism. Today in Hollywood, in order for a movie to be distributed in China, it has certain content that can't be in there. And so Americans don't realize this, but movies in America today are in many ways edited and censored by the Chinese government through the economic power and leverage of saying you won't be able to distribute to the most populous nation on earth if you have certain things in your movie or television or entertainment product. And I think that's their goal in journalism as well. And this is just the latest example of that.
I just had something, earlier Senator Marco Rubio mentioned, the chairman mentioned the hearing that we had that was focused on all of this surveillance capabilities and how they are rolling out with United States companies' complicity, this incredible surveillance state. Well, it was a great hearing, and we've asked that there be some actions taken to prevent the export of those kinds of items. Well, if you go back to 2006, I chaired a hearing on Microsoft, Cisco, Yahoo, and Google on their censorship and their enabling of the dictatorship then to censor anything that was critical, including Tiananmen Square. If you did a Google search of Tiananmen Square in China, and I did it at a cafe, you got only wonderful pictures of people smiling and posing for pictures, snapshots and videos. Nothing about the tanks, all of it censored out. And Google was a part of that. Now that very bitter fruit has gotten worse over the years. And as the chairman pointed out in our hearing, because he called that very important hearing, and I think there needs to be actions taken when our companies are complicit in enabling a police state to surveil, incarcerate. Remember Yahoo, Shurtao. Here's a guy that passed on to an NGO in New York information about what you can and cannot do about Tiananmen Square when that anniversary date came around. For that, he got 10 years in prison. And Yahoo coughed up all of the information, personally identifiable information, plus his contacts, and they convicted him with the information provided by Yahoo. So this has been a serious problem for a long time, and now it has really gone from very bad to much worse.
Yes, sir. In the red shirt. Well, I can tell you we've acted, or tried to, in terms of advocating to the administration that we would want to see individuals responsible for that policy become subject to global Magnitsky sanctions, losing visas, being named, having assets seized if possible, if they're here within the United States or within the banking system. And I know it's under consideration. Now, obviously, our policies here take some time. It has to run through this agency process. It can become bureaucratic, but we have hope that that is the direction that they're moving and taking action. But the other thing is, I would say, just in the last 3 months, while I don't think there's been sufficient global attention paid to this, there's been an increasing amount of global attention paid to this. Just a few months ago, frankly, I could not understand why the majority Muslim countries of the world stood silent as this was happening. And now we have started to see more and more of them express themselves in international forums concerned about it. So I think one of the things that just awareness of it at the global level, I think is important in terms of protecting people. But as far as U.S. policy is concerned, we have made a very strong, both of us have, push for the administration to sanction the individuals responsible for implementing this policy. And we are hopeful that they will take action in that direction sooner rather than later.
If I could just add briefly that this report today, this launch of this fact-based indictment of the PRC must, and I believe will be taken seriously by our government, by the Congress and the White House, State Department, of course, and other governments. I mean, people need to read this. It's a must-read. And when they do, today is the pivot point.
I can stay for one more, and then I have to go vote, and I'll try to come back. Yes, ma'am? Okay. If the Senate will pass it?
Yeah, and then do you expect the president to sign it?
I believe the president will sign it, and I do think, yeah, I've got to see where it is in our process. It's in the judiciary. It's been referred to one of our committees, and we hope here, I know that's of little interest to the world that we have this arcane process within the Senate for things to happen. But it is my hope that the Judiciary Committee will allow it to come out of the committee without hearing, because we don't have time for hearing, and be able to pass that unanimously on the floor. And my sense is that that is something that will pass. But, and I hope, and our push is for that to occur before the end of this Congress, which obviously ends at the end of December. So I'm confident that if we can get it onto the floor of the Senate in some form, it would pass without even a vote. We would have a unanimous consent on it. But we have to get through the procedural hurdle of our committees, which, you know, it's a Senate thing. It's tough to understand. But we want to get it there. We believe there's support for it, and we're working hard to get it accomplished. I got to leave. I have to go vote, and I'll be